Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. I gotta tell you, I am absolutely thrilled you're joining me because today we are unpacking something truly fascinating. We're looking at a highly unconventional piece of source material from 2012 titled, What Would Keynes Do with the Japanese Economy? Now, to be clear right up front, we're going to analyze this purely as a historical document of its time. It's basically a window into the intense economic anxieties of a very specific moment in Japan's history, and, well, the completely out-of-the-box way one author decided to tackle them. Okay, let's dive right in. So, right off the bat, you're probably asking, why on earth would a religious leader summon the spirit of a macroeconomist? It's a completely unexpected pairing, right? But that is the exact premise we're looking at today. The author Ryuho Okawa, the head of the religious movement Happy Science, published this text as a channeled dialogue with the spirit of the legendary 20th century British economist John Maynard Keynes. Now, we aren't here to debate the spiritual claims themselves. Instead, we're going to explore how this really unique framing device was used to deliver a blistering critique of Japanese economic policy right in the wake of a massive national tragedy. Here is our quick roadmap for today. First, Japan's economic crisis in early 2012. Second, the background of Keynes's spiritual message. Third, the strong sense of crisis toward the BOJ and government. Fourth, religion's duty to discuss economics. And fifth, choices for overcoming national hardship. All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, Japan's economic crisis in early 2012. To really wrap your head around this text, you have to understand the immense, almost suffocating pressure the country was under when it was published. Picture this. In March 2011, the Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami devastated the nation, literally an unprecedented disaster. Then, as we move into late 2011, the country isn't just dealing with the massive task of physical rebuilding, it's suffocating under severe deflation. Prices are continuously dropping, spending totally freezes, and the economy just grinds to a halt. On top of that, you have a historically strong yen, which makes Japanese goods way too expensive to sell abroad, basically crushing exporters. Then we hit early 2012, and instead of aggressively stimulating the economy, the government and the Ministry of Finance began pushing hard for tax hikes. This compounding timeline of disaster, stagnation, and what the author viewed as completely misguided fiscal policy, that is the exact powder keg that sparked the creation of this book. Right in the book's preface, the author lays out this really sharp, unyielding critique. He argues that the Ministry of Finance's push for tax increases completely lacked any sort of vision for economic development. He paints this vivid picture of a populace still reeling, just utterly exhausted by the 3.11 earthquake and the crushing weight of deflation. To push long-term tax hikes onto citizens who are already hurting that much, well, he argues it's like a, quote, devil from hell running away with its tail between his legs. I know, that is some highly emotive language, but it's strategically designed to highlight this profound disconnect he saw between the suffering public and the bureaucrats calling the shots. Which brings us to Section 2, the background of Keynes' spiritual message. Given this massive disconnect and national paralysis we just talked about, how did the author decide to inject his ideas into the public discourse? Well, on January 3rd, 2012, according to the book's prologue, the author claims to have summoned the spirit of John Maynard Keynes. The prologue is really explicit about the context here. The Japanese government and the Bank of Japan were paralyzed by this excessive fear of inflation, and they totally lacked a proper economic growth strategy. The author felt this overwhelming sense of crisis that normal political discourse just wasn't fixing. He needed a heavyweight, a giant of macroeconomics, to forcefully advocate for aggressive economic intervention to navigate the country out of this hardship. Now, to really grasp what's going on in this book, we have to understand its core mechanism, defined in the text as the spiritual message phenomenon. According to the author, this isn't your typical movie scene where a medium falls into a trance and completely loses consciousness. Instead, it's described as a highly enlightened individual, using their own consciousness and language centers to essentially translate the thoughts of a spirit, in this case, Keynes, into Japanese. Again, we're looking at this neutrally, just trying to understand the framework the author chose to present his macroeconomic policy proposals. It's a way to give this economic advice a real sense of transcendent authority. Let's move to Section 3, the strong sense of crisis toward the BOJ and government. So why was Keynes the right spirit for this specific moment in 2012? In the prologue, the author characterizes the Bank of Japan as an obstinate inflation fighter. The text claims that even after 2 decades of deflationary stagnation, the BOJ was overly timid. They were terrified of even a modest 2 to 3% inflation rate and obsessed with protecting the value of the currency rather than growing the economy. In stark contrast, Keynes is framed by the author as representing the economics of emergency. Think about it. Keynes is the ultimate symbol of aggressive, government-led intervention during a crisis. The author is using Keynes to argue that you absolutely cannot fight a catastrophic deflationary recession with cautious, penny-pinching policies. And the author pushes this critique even further. He actually claims to have previously channeled the guardian spirit of the sitting BOJ governor at the time, Masaki Shirakawa. According to this account, the governor's spirit dismissed Keynesian economics as useless and refused to manipulate the money supply to stimulate the economy. The author interprets this as a tragic lack of courage and vision. He basically accuses the central bank leadership of wanting to just sit comfortably in their chairs and do nothing, completely refusing to take responsibility for saving the nation's economy. Which leads directly to this really powerful philosophical argument from the text. Hayek is free market economics, Keynes is economics of emergency. The author makes the point that economists like Friedrich Hayek, with their non-interventionist free market theories, might be perfectly fine during normal, stable times. But 2012 Japan was absolutely not normal. It was a nation in ruins. The text argues that clinging to strict free market non-interventionism during an active national emergency is just a recipe for disaster. For the author, that made Keynes the essential philosophical guide for the moment.
All right, moving right along into Section 4, Religion's Duty to Discuss Economics.
Now, you might be wondering, why is a religious organization putting out books on central bank policy in the first place? Well, the ideological core of the entire book rests on this one belief. It is our duty to present a choice where citizens do not become unhappy. The author fully anticipates getting criticized for intervening in politics and economics, but he frames economic policy not just as math or bureaucracy, he frames it as a profound moral issue. If bad economic policy, like pushing ill-timed tax hikes during a fragile recovery, causes mass suffering, poverty, and despair, then the author argues it is the strict duty of religion to step in. For him, offering concrete macroeconomic guidelines to overcome the deflationary recession and the earthquake disaster is literally the highest form of spiritual salvation in the modern world. To defend this position against domestic critics, the author actually looks across the Pacific in the book's afterword. He points out that while the U.S. Constitution mandates a separation of church and state, it definitely does not silence believers. He even highlights Mitt Romney, a devout Mormon who was a major presidential candidate back in 2012, to argue that in advanced democracies, believers have every right, and honestly the obligation, to engage deeply in political and economic discourse. The really fascinating takeaway here is this total reversal of how we often view the separation of church and state. The author argues that faith shouldn't be a reason to stay out of politics. Instead, faith acts as our breakwater, a protective barrier that actually empowers citizens to freely discuss and fiercely criticize government actions without fear. In his view, faith guarantees the freedom of speech necessary to hold institutions like the Ministry of Finance and the Bank of Japan accountable. And that brings us to our final section, Section 5, Choices for Overcoming National Hardship. So, what were the actual economic policies this Keynesian spirit proposed to overcome this hardship? The text offers a sweeping macroeconomic overhaul. The alleged spirit advocates for massive disaster recovery spending funded by government bonds, not tax hikes. It calls for completely rethinking the social security system to avoid bankrupting the state. It suggests radically reframing the brutally strong yen not as a curse, but as a boost to buying power. It strongly advocates for joining the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, to boost free trade. And it pushes for massive national infrastructure development, likening it to building a modern Great Wall of disaster preparedness. These chapters directly target the specific, paralyzing fears of 2012. Take the strong yen, for example. Instead of panicking, the text argues that Japan should use the strong currency to import resources cheaply, buy foreign assets, and basically act like a mature, confident creditor nation. By putting these arguments into the mouth of Keynes, the author is trying to shock the Japanese public and policymakers out of their deflationary pessimism. He's offering a highly expansionary, optimistic way out of the crisis. And that wraps up our explainer for today. We've seen how a religious movement used the alleged spirit of a 20th century economist to wage this massive rhetorical war against Japan's central bank and fiscal policies in 2012. It really leaves us with a compelling question. Where exactly do we draw the line between faith, the state, and economic policy when a nation is facing an existential crisis? It's a fascinating look at how economic anxiety can manifest in highly unconventional ways. Thank you so much for exploring this with me today, and as always, keep questioning the world around you. Let's dive right in. Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're unpacking some truly unique source material.
We're looking at a text published back in 2012 that analyzes Japan's political and economic response to the devastating 2011 Great East Japan earthquake. But here's the catch. It approaches this through a highly unusual lens. It's a book by Ryuho Okawa that actually claims to channel the spirit of the legendary macroeconomist John Maynard Keynes. So whether you're into economics, crisis management, or just fascinated by how spiritual movements interpret public policy, this is an absolutely captivating framework to explore.
Here is our quick roadmap for today. 1. Earthquake reconstruction and tax hikes. 2. TEPCO and maintaining nuclear power. 3. Preparing for the next crisis. And 4. Recommending Keynesian investment.
For this explainer, we are going to focus entirely on Chapter 1 of the text, which is aptly titled Economic Policy for Disaster Recovery. The author is deeply focused on the intersection of disaster response and macroeconomic theory, and we're going to decode exactly how this spiritual interpretation of Keynes views national rebuilding. Section 1. Earthquake reconstruction and tax hikes. Rebuilding without taxing. Now, following the massive 2011 disaster, the immediate, obvious question for the Japanese government was how to actually fund this monumental rebuilding effort. The Japanese government's approach at the time leaned heavily into floating tax increases to cover those massive recovery costs. But the source takes a decidedly harsh stance against this. The channeled spirit of Keynes vehemently argues that the government was essentially just using the disaster as a convenient political excuse to push through long-desired tax hikes. And the rhetoric here doesn't pull any punches. The text literally calls the government's stance, quote, cowardly. The core argument is that slapping heavier taxes on a traumatized, economically vulnerable population during a time of national mourning is just fundamentally bad macroeconomic policy, hiding behind a mask of necessity.
So, if the text completely shuts down the government's fiscal response, you might be wondering, how does it evaluate the response to the concurrent nuclear crisis? Well, this is where the material takes a highly controversial turn, pivoting right from tax policy into corporate responsibility. Section 2. TEPCO and maintaining nuclear power. Defending nuclear energy.
At a time when domestic and global media were relentlessly criticizing TEPCO for the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster, this text steps in with a robust defense. It actively highlights the intense, frontline struggles of the company's workers during the peak of the meltdown. On top of that, it heavily critiques the journalism of the time, arguing the media was just looking for a scapegoat and unfairly shifting all societal and governmental blame onto the company. Because of this perspective, the source strongly pushes back against reactionary calls to completely abolish nuclear power in Japan. And this advocacy isn't just about keeping the lights on. The author insists on building new, highly safe nuclear plants to secure independent energy resources, directly tying this capability to Japan's broader national defense strategy. The view here is that abandoning nuclear energy would leave the nation incredibly geopolitically vulnerable. Now, this intense focus on vulnerability brings up a really important question. Beyond energy security, how does the text view Japan's physical readiness for future disasters? Let's transition from looking backward at the 2011 response to looking forward at what this text predicts is coming next. Section 3. Preparing for the next crisis. Predicting future threats. This is where the source shifts gears from a retrospective economic critique into the realm of futuristic, spiritual disaster prophecy. The text uses some very vivid, specific terminology to categorize these national threats. It refers to the devastating 2011 earthquake and tsunami as a water attack. But then it issues this stark warning. The nation must urgently prepare for what it calls fire attacks. In this context, fire attacks are predicted to be massive volcanic eruptions or even foreign missile strikes. The author insists that defending against these specific threats absolutely has to be the new national priority. To survive these predicted fire attacks, the text actually proposes some surprisingly concrete technological solutions. It argues there's an absolute pressing need for systems that can rapidly evacuate massive amounts of people. Specifically, it calls for the heavy development of advanced helicopters and the widespread deployment of VTOL, or vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. So rather than just pouring concrete for higher seawalls, the focus shifts entirely to rapid airborne mobilization. Okay, but think about the massive logistical puzzle this creates. If the text completely rejects tax hikes, like we talked about in Section 1, but at the same time demands the creation of an expansive, cutting-edge aerospace defense network, what exactly is the proposed economic path forward? How on earth do we pay for all this? Section 4, recommending Keynesian investment, funding through growth. This is exactly where the core economic theory of the historical John Maynard Keynes comes back into play, channeled through this spiritual framework. To really understand the solution here, we have to talk about the multiplier effect. It's a foundational Keynesian economic concept. The basic idea is that bold initial government investment, like, say, spending billions on a brand new network of VTOL aircraft, doesn't just drain public funds. It creates jobs, which puts money in people's pockets, which they then spend at local businesses. That ultimately leads to a proportionally much larger increase in overall economic income and recovery. So, tying it all together, the core thesis of Chapter 1 is remarkably clear. First, absolutely reject the idea of using disaster recovery as an excuse for taxation, because that just stifles the damaged economy. Second, immediately implement bold, large-scale government investments into national security and advanced disaster tech. And third, trust that utilizing the multiplier effect from those massive initial investments will organically drive genuine economic expansion. Which brings us to our wrap-up. What we've explored today is a deeply unconventional intersection of ideas. We're looking at traditional macroeconomic theory, specifically Keynesian stimulus, blended with a robust corporate defense of nuclear energy, all framed within a spiritual disaster prophecy about water and fire attacks. It is, without a doubt, a highly unique blueprint for national survival. I want to leave you with this final thought to chew on. Does framing traditional economic and defense policies through a spiritual lens fundamentally change how a nation might view disaster recovery? Whether you look at this text as a religious curiosity or a provocative critique of fiscal austerity, it undeniably forces us to examine the mechanics of national rebuilding from a completely different angle.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a highly unconventional, honestly fascinating text about Japan's economic policy. We're going to be looking at social security and welfare from a perspective you have likely never encountered before. So let's just get right into it.
Okay, here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with Section 1, the spiritual message premise, followed by Section 2, the pension contradiction. Then we're going to cover Section 3, the dangers of high welfare, move into Section 4, the infrastructure alternative, and finally wrap things up with Section 5, the final takeaway.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the spiritual message premise. To really understand the arguments we're about to explore, we first need to understand the source's, well, highly unusual framework. We're looking at a 2012 book that claims to literally channel the spirit of the famous British economist, John Maynard Keynes. The text defines this spiritual message phenomenon as being completely distinct from standard trance mediumship. It describes a process where a spiritual entity's words are essentially spoken down and translated directly into Japanese to address modern economic problems.
So, the crucial point for us today is this. We are going to look strictly and objectively at the economic arguments being made through this unique lens. We're not here to debate the religious viewpoint or endorse the spiritual mechanics of how the book was written. Instead, we just want to focus entirely on the actual policy critiques the author is putting forward. And as you'll see, they are quite bold.
Moving right along to Section 2, the pension contradiction.
This brings us to the real meat of the text's critique, which you'll find in Chapter 2. When outlining the ideal state of Social Security, the text doesn't hold back. It immediately goes on the offensive, directly accusing Japan's current pension system and its countermeasures for an aging population of containing fatal logical contradictions. Let's break down exactly what those contradictions are. The source points out a massive, undeniable demographic reality. Japan has a rapidly aging population combined with a severely declining birth rate. Because of this, the author argues that aiming for a highly state-dependent welfare state is fundamentally flawed. I mean, the math simply doesn't work out when a shrinking base of young taxpayers is expected to support a massive, ever-growing elderly population. It's like trying to balance a pyramid on its tick.
That leads us into Section 3, the dangers of high welfare. You see, the source doesn't just critique the math. It actually offers a really sharp ideological warning. It argues that a high welfare state, one that simply gives according to need, is essentially a Marxist trap. The claim here is that implementing this kind of ideology suppresses vital self-help efforts. Ultimately, it leads to the rapid decline of overall national power because excessive reliance on state handouts drains the nation's vitality rather than supporting it.
And this brilliantly illustrates a stark central dichotomy in the text. On one hand, pouring massive amounts of money into pure welfare is argued to yield zero true economic growth. It's essentially viewed as a sunk cost. On the other hand, the text heavily champions public works. It argues that combining individual self-help with strategic, structural investments is what actually builds the nation, creates jobs, and drives the economy forward in a sustainable way.
Let's dive into Section 4, the infrastructure alternative. If high welfare spending is the problem, the proposed solution is a massive pivot. The argument is that public funds absolutely must be redirected away from pure welfare handouts and put into long-lasting public works. Specifically, the text highlights national defense, large-scale disaster prevention, think massive breakwaters to protect against tsunamis, and robust transportation networks. These aren't just seen as expenses, they're vital investments that generate lasting economic ripple effects throughout the entire country.
To really drive this point home, the text uses a pretty memorable analogy. It compares these proposed public works to the Great Wall of China. The author argues that investing in monumental, long-term defensive and infrastructural projects leaves lasting physical and economic value for generations. In the author's eyes, this proactive structural investment is the absolute best way to truly protect the lives and livelihoods of the citizens, way more than any monthly welfare check ever could.
And finally, Section 5, the final takeaway.
So, we've traced this entire argument, right? From the sheer demographic math problem to an ideological rejection of high welfare, all the way to a massive pitch for massive public works. Now, I want to leave you with this question to critically reflect on. If a highly state-dependent welfare system truly risks draining national power in the face of an aging population, how should a modern nation effectively balance its necessary social safety net with the massive, long-term infrastructure and defense investments required for future growth? It is an incredibly complex balancing act, but exploring texts like this, no matter how unconventional their origin, forces us to look at these vital economic questions from completely new angles. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I really hope this leaves you eager to dive even deeper into the complex world of economic theory.
Welcome to today's explainer. We're going to unpack a genuinely fascinating and honestly highly unorthodox piece of economic source material today. We're traveling back to early 2012, which was a time when Japan was gripped by profound, really suffocating economic anxieties. The text we're examining today took those exact terrifying vulnerabilities and literally flipped them completely upside down. We're going to look at how a situation that felt utterly hopeless for an entire nation was radically reframed from a defensive nightmare right into a highly aggressive strategic playbook. It really forces us to ask, how do you save an economy when its people are totally paralyzed by fear? Well, let's find out.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. Number 1, the 2012 economic paralysis. 2, a radical macroeconomic reframe. 3, strong yen as an asset. 4, the TPP agricultural pivot. And 5, the Great Japan Federation.
Starting right off with Section 1, the 2012 economic paralysis.
To truly grasp the paradigm shift we're about to discuss, you really have to put yourself in the shoes of a Japanese citizen or policymaker in early 2012. You've got this cascade of seemingly fatal threats. First, the country was shrouded in overwhelming economic gloom following the devastating disasters of 2011. And on top of that massive recovery burden, by early 2012, Japan was facing a historically strong yen. Now, standard consensus viewed this as a complete disaster because it made Japanese manufactured goods unbelievably expensive to sell overseas, threatening the absolute core of their export economy. And if that wasn't enough, you had the impending Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the TPP, which the public largely viewed as an absolute death sentence for Japan's heavily protected, traditional local farming industry.
So when you combine a battered post-disaster economy, an export-crushing currency, and the looming threat of cheap foreign imports destroying local agriculture, you end up with a nation entirely and desperately on the defensive. I mean, everyone from the top economic advisors down to the everyday consumer believed their core economic drivers were completely hopeless. So the monumental question becomes, how do you possibly pivot out of this?
That brings us to Section 2, a radical macroeconomic reframe.
Now, what's really interesting about this is the source itself. Specifically, Chapter 3 of our source material, recorded on January 3rd, 2012, explicitly targets turning both the strong yen and the TPP into massive opportunities. Now, I do need to add a quick caveat for our explainer today. This text is famously presented as a channeled spiritual message from the legendary British economist John Maynard Keynes.
While that's a highly unique, definitely unconventional premise, we're going to intentionally set aside the religious and spiritual framing today. We don't take sides or endorse specific viewpoints here. Instead, we're impartially focusing entirely on objectively analyzing the highly aggressive, contrarian macroeconomic strategies it actually proposes. Because honestly, the economic arguments alone are a total masterclass in crisis management.
The contrast here is just striking. The prevailing status quo was strictly defensive. The government, the central bank, they were practically paralyzed by fear, trying desperately to artificially suppress the currency just to save traditional exporters. The book's proposal, however, is purely offensive. It uses lateral thinking to completely flip the script. Instead of trying to fix a broken defensive line, it asks, hey, how do we weaponize the current economic landscape to our absolute advantage? Let's look at exactly how they do that in Section 3, Strong Yen as an Asset. Instead of mourning the strong currency as this fatal blow to export industries, the text fiercely pushes back. It argues that a strong yen is actually concrete evidence that Japan has evolved into a fully mature, wealthy nation. The logic here is pretty rock solid. Only a truly developed, powerful economy can command that kind of currency strength in the global market in the first place. Therefore, trying to artificially suppress it, that's actually a massive step backward. You shouldn't mourn it, you should use it. And this brilliantly illustrates the standard economic theory on how you actually turn that supposed liability into a weapon. Step 1. You take that incredibly strong yen and you use its massive purchasing power to buy overseas resources and foreign companies at a steep discount. Step 2. You massively expand your imports, bringing in high-quality, incredibly affordable goods from all around the world. And Step 3. You use that massive influx of cheap foreign goods to stimulate a huge domestic consumption boom. You're using the strength of the currency to enrich the domestic populace and acquire global assets, rather than just endlessly worrying about how many cars you can sell abroad. Which naturally leads us to Section 4, the TPP agricultural pivot. Much like the strong yen, the TPP was viewed with absolute dread, specifically by the agricultural sector. But the source text argues that playing defense by forming bloc economies is fundamentally a losing game in the 21st century. The era of overprotecting domestic agriculture and hiding behind high tariffs to keep cheap imports out is simply over. It's an outdated model, and all it does is stifle innovation and growth. So instead of being terrified of cheap agricultural imports ruining local farmers, the text proposes a massive strategic pivot. Go on the offensive. Japan should actually capitalize on free trade. But, how do you do that if your crops are too expensive to export? Well, by exporting what Japan actually excels at, highly advanced agricultural technology and intellectual property. The strategy is to go out into the world, teach high-yield, efficient farming techniques overseas, and essentially guide and manage global agricultural production, rather than just hiding behind a wall and hoping the rest of the world ignores you. And that grand vision brings us to Section 5, the Great Japan Federation. So the crucial point is how this all comes together into a vision termed the Great Japan Federation. Now, we have to be very clear here. This is not some traditional, archaic military empire. Not at all. It envisions an expansive, highly modern economic network. It's a sphere of influence built organically on shared knowledge, agricultural guidance, and technological leadership. It's all about Japan leading by teaching, investing, and guiding global production, utilizing the very trade agreements and currency strengths they were initially so terrified of. When we look back at this text today, regardless of its highly unconventional origins, the analytical framework is undeniably fascinating. It shows us that flipping fatal threats into unbelievable opportunities fundamentally changes the rules of macroeconomic engagement. A radically optimistic lens, combined with a willingness to just completely abandon defensive postures, well, that might just be the ultimate strategic playbook for any nation facing a crisis. It really leaves us with a powerful thought to chew on. When you, or your country, or your business, are faced with a supposedly fatal economic threat, do you just hunker down and build a higher wall to hide behind? Or do you take a step back, look at the board laterally, and change the rules of the game entirely? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer of this truly unique source material. Keep questioning the consensus, keep looking at your obstacles from new angles, and I'll see you in the next explainer. Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to the explainer. Today, we're throwing it back to a genuinely pivotal moment in modern economic history, the 2012 European debt crisis. But look, we aren't just hashing out standard textbook theories here. We're breaking down a highly unique, deeply unconventional macroeconomic analysis of that exact crisis. We're going to examine a fascinating structural critique of the European Union, dissecting the arguments laid out in our source material to see exactly how it diagnosed the problem, and more importantly, what radical solutions it proposed. So here's our roadmap. First, analyzing the 2012 EU crisis, then diving into the structural issue known as the Union of the Weak. After that, history's lesson on colonial management, the worst-case scenario, and finally a prescription to save the EU. Let's get to it. Section 1. Analyzing the 2012 EU crisis. To really get this, we've got to ground ourselves in the historical context of early 2012. Europe was absolutely gripped by massive financial uncertainty. You had these sovereign debt crises rippling across multiple nations, literally threatening the very survival of the euro. Now, to understand the specific analysis we're unpacking today, we have to look directly at the source. We're pulling from Chapter 4 of a text published in early 2012, titled Predicting the Future of the EU. And the premise of this text is, frankly, pretty wild. It's actually presented as the channeled spiritual words of the legendary economist John Maynard Keynes, and it was recorded specifically on January 3, 2012. Now, regardless of how you might personally approach the origin of this text, our goal in this explainer is to be entirely objective. We are just going to strictly examine the economic theory, the structural critiques presented right there on the page. We're keeping our focus squarely on the macroeconomic arguments it makes regarding the actual mechanics of the European Union. Section 2. Structural Issue, Union of the Weak. Now, what's really interesting about this is that the text doesn't just blame bad budgets. It actually points to the very architecture of the integration as the foundational flaw of the EU. The text coins this concept the union of the weak. The core argument here is that integrating vastly unequal economies, nations with totally different levels of productivity, debt, and fiscal discipline, creates a system that is just inherently fragile. Think about it. By forcing them into a single currency union, you completely remove those natural safety valves, like currency devaluation, that weaker economies would normally use to recover. So what happens? Well, this structure forces the strongest nations, specifically pointing toward economic powerhouses like Germany, to bear a massive, totally disproportionate financial burden. The system effectively requires that strongest member to just constantly prop up the weaker states, basically to prevent the whole structure from collapsing. And the analysis argues that this kind of intense financial strain is simply unsustainable in the long run. Section 3. History's Lesson, Colonial Management. To really explain why this structure is destined to struggle, the source draws on a pretty unexpected historical comparison. And this brilliantly illustrates the point. The text explicitly compares the European Union's economic integration strategy to pre-war Japan's colonial management. It argues that just as pre-war Japan poured immense resources and really heavy investment into its territories, the EU is doing the exact same thing with its poorer member nations. The real crux of this historical analogy is the shared structural flaw. We're talking massive investment without viable economic returns. In both of these scenarios, you have a central power pumping just vast amounts of capital into less developed regions, hoping to elevate that, right? But according to the text, if those investments don't actually generate the necessary economic returns to sustain the overarching system, well, the burden eventually becomes fatal to the investing power. Section 4. The worst-case scenario. So if that structural flaw really is fatal, what happens when the system breaks? I gotta warn you, the prognosis here is rather grim. The text makes a really striking prediction about the inevitable social fallout of this economic imbalance. It argues that there is a high probability of severe unrest. The logic is straightforward, but it's devastating. Basically, there is a hard limit to how much a wealthy nation can tax its own citizens to bail out foreign neighbors. When that limit is hit and the financial support just stops, the resulting economic crash in those weaker nations will inevitably lead to social collapse. We're talking riots and looting. Let's break down the exact cause and effect chain the book proposes. Step 1. Force the integration of unequal economies. Step 2. The financial burden maximizes on the strong nations. Step 3. Political and economic realities force that financial support to cease entirely. And step 4. Without that artificial support, street-level instability and chaos erupt. It perfectly illustrates how these high-level macroeconomic policies, when they're flawed, they directly translate into very real-world human crises. Section 5. Prescription to save the EU. Let's move on and see how this builds, because the text doesn't just diagnose the disease here, it offers a pretty radical prescription to save the global economy. The proposed solutions are honestly where things get incredibly interesting. Rather than just demanding Europe fix itself from within, the text actually places the immediate responsibility on the outside world. It dictates two major steps. First, Global pillars like Japan and the US must prioritize their own domestic economic growth above all else. Second, it says there has to be strict caution against providing easy bailout funding to Europe through organizations like the IMF. Now, this is a deeply counterintuitive macroeconomic approach, right? Because the standard political reflex is to just immediately bail out the failing system to prevent contagion. But this text argues that you literally cannot save a sinking ship by tying it to other struggling vessels. The global economy needs the US and Japan to be overwhelmingly strong, self-sustaining anchors. Pumping easy money into a flawed union of the weak just prolongs the inevitable. You have to strengthen the outside pillars first so they're sturdy enough to withstand the shock when that flawed system ultimately has to reorganize itself.
So we've unpacked a highly unconventional take on the 2012 crisis today, looking at this concept of the union of the weak, these historical analogies of investment without return, and a global, rather than local, prescription for recovery. Which leaves us with this final, genuinely provocative macroeconomic question to ponder. Can a union of vastly unequal economies ever truly succeed without fundamentally sacrificing the stability of its strongest members? It's a question that goes way beyond 2012, really challenging how we view global economic integration today. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and definitely keep questioning the structures around you. Let's jump right in. Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to objectively unpack a seriously fascinating and, honestly, highly unconventional set of economic policy proposals published in Japan back in 2012. We're looking at a text that takes standard macroeconomic anxiety and answers it with some of the most radical monetary visions you'll probably ever encounter. Whether you're an economics student, a policy buff, or just someone who loves exploring outside-the-box thinking, this analysis is absolutely going to challenge how you look at the fundamental rules of national economies. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with 1, the 2012 spiritual message, move into 2, debunking financial collapse, explore 3, the pro-inflation route, dive into 4, privatizing currency, and finally wrap up with 5, investing in the future. Section 1, the 2012 spiritual message. Let's establish our primary source, because it's pretty unique. We're analyzing a 2012 book authored by Ryuho Okawa titled What Would Keynes Do About the Japanese Economy? And get this, it's framed as a spiritual message channeled straight from the legendary 20th century British economist John Maynard Keynes, recorded right around January 3rd, 2012. Now, keeping entirely neutral on that spiritual premise, we are going to dive headfirst into the very real, tangible economic blueprint it lays out, specifically Chapter 5, which gives us a bold, maybe even audacious, roadmap for Japan's future. Section 2, debunking financial collapse. In Chapter 5, the author takes dead aim at the status quo anxiety that was totally paralyzing Japan's economic policy at the time. You know, the prevailing narrative was this intense fear of an inevitable financial collapse because of the country's massive government debt. Authorities were pushing hard for austerity and tax hikes to stop a sovereign default. But this text, it outright dismisses that fear. It boldly asserts that a financial bankruptcy for Japan is practically impossible. Why? Because it points directly to the country's underlying economic fortress, its colossal reserves of personal financial assets, and the sheer massive scale of its GDP. The argument here is that the government is foolishly confusing its own balance sheet with the actual, much larger wealth of the entire nation. Section 3, the pro-inflation route. So, having tossed the debt crisis out the window, the text pivots to what it sees as the real enemy here. It heavily criticizes central bank authorities, arguing they're basically acting like inflation fighters in a building that desperately needs to be warmed up. It argues that leaving a deflationary spiral unchecked is a catastrophic policy failure. Instead, it insists that true, sustained economic development is completely impossible without a deliberate shift. The book advocates for setting clear inflation targets to create a moderate, controlled inflation route. And this isn't presented as some necessary evil. It's an absolute prerequisite to wake the economy from its stagnation and get people spending and investing again. Section 4, privatizing currency issuings. Okay, this is where our explainer transitions from standard macroeconomic debates into truly radical, paradigm-shifting territory. Take a look at the Chapter 5 table of contents. It doesn't just stop at an inflation target. It proposes sweeping systemic changes to the very architecture of how Japan handles its money. The stated goal isn't just domestic stability anymore. It's to elevate the yen to unprecedented power on the global stage.
To achieve that kind of global dominance, the text outlines a genuinely unorthodox strategy. Step 1, abolish the central bank's absolute monopoly on printing money. Crazy, right? Step 2, actually privatize currency issuance by allowing successful megabanks and proven business leaders to issue their own currency, essentially creating a competitive market for money itself. And step 3, use this dynamic, expanded monetary supply to establish the yen as a global key currency, a foundational standard of value worldwide. It's a proposal that totally forces us to question why the state must be the sole creator of money in a modern economy.
Section 5. Investing in the future.
Now, the tax doesn't just want to print money for the fun of it. It ties these radical policies to a grand physical vision. It insists Japan must fulfill what it terms its public mission, or in Japanese, oyake no shime. It defines this not as balancing a spreadsheet through financial austerity, but as a moral and economic imperative to execute massive, forward-looking investments. True leadership, it argues, means looking decades ahead and investing the capital required to ensure the nation thrives for generations, rather than just retreating in fear of debt. Specifically, Chapter 5 calls for funneling this new economic energy into large-scale national infrastructure projects. It explicitly highlights making sweeping upgrades to the transportation network. The idea is that by pouring resources into physical connectivity and state-of-the-art transit, the country gets an immediate economic stimulus while simultaneously building the literal foundation for a visionary future. It actually compares this level of ambition to building a modern-day Great Wall, but, not for isolation, as a monumental investment in domestic resilience and long-term economic development. So, as we conclude this explainer, we are left with a highly provocative concept. Whether you accept the premise of this 2012 text or not, it succeeds in doing exactly what fringe or radical economics is meant to do. It forces us to think. When a text suggests something as shocking as privatizing currency issuance to defeat deflation and fund massive public infrastructure, it demands we ask ourselves, how do these unorthodox proposals force us to reevaluate the boundaries of traditional monetary policy? Are the current rules of our financial system permanent laws of nature, or simply habits we are just too afraid to break? It's a fascinating question, and for sure one that leaves us with plenty more to explore. Thanks so much for learning with us today.